Hello everyone, this is a call. And so what I want to talk about today is I want to talk about authentic sexual expression. Specifically, are you a slave to your sexual energy? This is it's been a big topic for me lately. I've been sort of studying and thinking about why it is that people do the things they do sexually. And I'm not here to define what is authentic for you, right? Authentic is something that each individual is here to define for themselves. However, there is a template. Let me get into that. So one of my spiritual teachers, or at least what I consider one of my spiritual teachers, was Osho. Osho, I think the one thing that really stuck in my brain about Osho is he said that the path towards liberation is through contemplation, concentration, meditation. So I'm hopefully going to give you in this video something you can contemplate. But what does contemplation, concentration, and meditation ultimately offer you? Space. A path towards neutrality. Objectivity, right? So what is it that most men, in particular, I'm going to speak mostly about men, most of the time, some sexual desire rises to the surface and we simply want to do it. We want to express it, either, literally through engaging sexually or through masturbation and pornography and entertaining the fantasy mentally. So when it's operating in kind of an unconscious manner, let's say, I'm going to use the same example, which we'll use cuckolding. So cuckolding is, for those of you who don't understand this is like, men or women who they end up having, they want to watch their partner have sex with somebody else. Again, could be very hot and steamy. That's not what I'm suggesting. Is this a good fantasy or a bad fantasy? I'm not going there. The question is does the individual who wants to do this thing understand why they want to do this thing? Right? Well, it's through contemplation, concentration, and meditation that we gain space and the ability to perceive whether it is we truly want to do something. One of the ways that this can work, let me go ahead and I'll elaborate on the cuckolding example. So let's say the fantasy rises to the surface and the individual goes off to their computer. And they start looking for videos on Pornhub or whatever. And they get there and they're like, yeah. And they handle themselves, right? You understood my gesture, I assume. Then they release. Nothing was resolved. They push away from the computer and they go about their day, right? Because they're like, oh, that's just what does it for me. Okay. Did it always do it for you? Were you like 15 years old and that's what did it for you at 15? I doubt it. So, in other words, there was no exploration as to why they wanted to do it in the first place. Well, let's say, continue on that same example, that this individual who just like rubbed one out to, some cuckolding porn, let's say that their partner or their wife or their spouse or whoever ended up cheating on them 10 years prior. So 10 years ago, they were cheated on. Very emotionally intense period of time. All these emotions come to the surface, and it's the jealousy and the possessiveness and this thing, the sense of betrayal and being lied to, and it's very intense, right? So that creates a trauma. A trauma is like an adhesion, right? It's like a knot. Let's say you have a really nasty knot in your upper part of your back. You can't get at it, right? This knot just sits there and festers and bugs you. And the knot in your back will keep sending a signal of pain over and over and over and over and over until that knot, you go to a massage therapist and they work out that knot for you. You go to a chiropractor or whatever and they work it out for you. Then it's resolved. And then the energy can move on and you no longer get the signal of pain. So that's like a really obvious way to kind of look at it. But what happens with the guy who just got cheated on? He's got this impression, in this case, it's held in the electromagnetic field in the energy body. He's got this adhesion, this trauma, and it vibrates. Zzz, it vibrates. And it sends a signal. So the signal is like moving through us. We don't always acknowledge a signal. I mean, there's far too much going on within ourselves to experience everything all the time, right? We'd be completely overwhelmed with the amount of content that goes through our mind if we were able to perceive all the content go through our mind. So what ends up happening, though, is horny will rise. So horny rises. It grabs the content. So horny, let's say, is like this. It's very natural. And then wrapped around it is this trauma. And it materializes in the individual's mind as, I want to watch my partner have sex with someone else. The cuckold fantasy. And then let's say they do it, or they go masturbate to it, or whatever. How they can tell something is authentic or not is pre-cum, post-cum, in the case of men. So, pre-cum, they're all about it. Oh, this is so exciting. This is so hot. It's so engaging. It's so indulgent. It's like, oh my God. Then they release. What happens? Sobriety. All the emotional content rushes to the surface. Their possessiveness, their jealousy, all this trauma. Hopefully they're objective enough to be present with it when it rises to the surface. Otherwise, they continue to be a slave to it. So what I would suggest is we bypass this whole process. The Dalai Lama said it really great. Made a really great comment. This is like in the early 2000s. He was doing a talk at, I think it was the University of Wisconsin. Somebody asked him what we needed the most going forward into this new age. He said discernment. I always thought that was an incredibly brilliant comment just because it was, well, one, it was an incredibly simple answer, but this idea of discernment, meaning that we're being flooded with impressions, with information. So all this information, all this content is coming at us all the time. So our egos are becoming more and more dense, more and more complex as we take on all these new impressions. I identify politically as this. I identify sexually as this. I identify as this, that, and everything else. You know, we identify with our possessions, our jobs, whatever it is. Our egos are becoming more and more dense, more and more complex, and we're becoming more and more confused because there's no simplicity. And having sexual fantasies that badger you, that you essentially push you for fulfillment, essentially, if we keep indulging these fantasies, but we don't ever actually learn why the fantasies are actually occurring, then we continue to deepen our misery and our slavery. So in order to liberate yourself from the sexual energy, the slavery of the sexual energy, what one could try doing is when the fantasy rises to the surface, connect to the feeling, right? So let go the storyline. In the case of the cuckolding, you're letting go of watching your partner do XYZ, and you connect to the feeling, right? So the horny in and of itself, the energy in and of itself is loud, and it's felt in the physical body. So the body resonates like this. It's a very slow vibration. The mind is like this. And one analogy you can think about is, think about, kayaking or canoeing down a river. You hit some rapids. The rapids are like this. Very difficult to control the canoe or the kayak in rapids, right? It's too much motion. You just kind of have to surrender to the flow of it, right? So when you come out of the rapids, though, the water becomes much more still, and you can paddle around, and you can kind of navigate it, and you can kind of approach it more at your leisure that way. So this is essentially what happens when you disconnect from the sexual fantasy itself and you go into the feeling. Another good way to look at this is hunger. So hunger rises to the surface. That is the raw form of the energy. That is the authentic energy, right? The energy that rises to the surface is authentic. I am hungry. My body is asking me to find food. Now, what can potentially be inauthentic is, how do we fulfill that hunger, right? So, let's say the mind goes to, I want cake. Person goes impulsively, unconsciously, as a slave, and gets cake. They eat the big piece of cake. They feel like crap afterwards. That was not an authentic expression or an authentic action taken based on what was essentially authentic energy, which was hunger. We attached cake to it. They ate the cake. They had buyer's remorse. Didn't feel great after eating the cake. And this is often times what happens with sexual energy stuff. Some fantasy rises to the surface. The person wants to do it. They rub one out. They masturbate or they act out sexually. Afterwards, they're like, ooh, I shouldn't have done that. That sobering moment post-cum where every guy all of a sudden gets clear. And those are the situations we're trying to avoid because we're not wanting to add additional traumas to our life, right? And so many men are operating, particularly these days, on sexual impulse. I created a program. It's called the Sovereign Male Program. My website's posted down below the video. You can go check it out. And part of this program is really about helping men recognize what is authentic. And I'm not talking about your sexual identity here, right? I'm not interested in your sexual identity. Your sexual identity is very much just like your personality or some other aspect of your personality, which is, our personality is kind of like a tool that we have, and we can refine that tool or not refine that tool from point A to point B, from birth to death. We have this tool throughout our course of our life, and that's all the ego is. The sad reality is that we live in a world and a culture today in particular in which our identity has become like everything, right? You have people yelling and screaming at each other about their identities, which is absolute nonsense, because what you're doing is you're overlooking the fact that it doesn't matter what your sexual preferences are or the color of your skin or any of this kind of thing. We're losing sight of our shared humanity. Whether you like it or not, it's the shared humanity that's the future, maybe the very far off future, my sort of optimistic, idealistic kind of, 50, 60, 70 years from now, I'll be able to look at someone, regardless of the color of their skin, and say, hey, that's another human being. We have something in common, right? 10 fingers, 10 toes, 2 arms, 2 legs, whatever it is. So my Sovereign Male program is to help men push the reset button so that they can discover what is authentic, their authentic sexual expression, liberate themselves from pornography, liberate themselves from impulse, to rebuild their sexual energy so that it is theirs to control. This will increase your sexual magnetism, right? You'll become a much more attractive person. You'll become a clear thinking human being. And ultimately, like I said, your cognition changes, your ability to creatively express, your ability to speak. I like to think you're more of a man if you do this, right? Not necessarily my program, but if you operate with discernment in regards to sexual energy. It's one of the primary loudest signals for men to deal with, and so many men simply never do. So yes, it makes you more of a man if you deal with it. So with all that said, like I said, I highly encourage you to check out my website and check out the program. And if you have any questions, you can post them down below the video, and I will, in all likelihood, make an attempt to answer that question. So I appreciate you all. Thank you for watching the video.